Well, when life is out of control, it's really uncomfortable. Life out of control is really, really uncomfortable. You don't even need to be a control freak to know that. When life isn't within your control, it's really uncomfortable. Think of a Western movie. It seems like most Western movies have somebody, they're loading kids into a wagon or something, and the adults aren't up there, the driver's not there yet. Before they can climb up, there's a gunshot or a snake or something, spooks the horses, and they go running as fast as they can, inevitably toward a cliff with a deep ravine or a raging river or something really dramatic. And so it makes you uncomfortable. You wonder what's happening. Something's out of control. You're wondering what's going to happen to the kids. Is somebody going to be able to ride up fast enough on horseback and take control of it? And you're sitting there in the comfort of your couch or in your recliner, but still something inside you is like, well, this is out of control. I don't like this. But we really don't need runaway wagons or movies to tell us about that, to feel uncomfortable. Because life has a way of making us feel out of control. Life has a way of making us feel out of control. Shortly after we moved into our house, before we were able to get baby gates up, our then 2-year-old son tumbled the entire way down the steps. And I saw it from a distance. I wasn't able to do anything. I was completely out of control and had that pit of your stomach feeling, and I couldn't do anything. And to this day, as a result of that moment, I always check to make sure the gate is closed or the doorway is closed, because I want some sense of control. And even though I do that, I know I can't do anything to totally stop it or fix it, because things are going to happen that are out of my control. And there are some things we just can't control, and it usually triggers worry and anxiety and sleeplessness, and we wonder what's going to happen, how will we get through this, what does it mean? And if you're not relating to any of that, just think of politics. I mean, you bring up politics and you talk about out of control, there's genuine feelings of wondering what's going to happen, what's going to go on, and that's regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. It's not a good feeling. It's never comfortable. And in chapter 2 of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar is uncomfortable because of a dream. He's uncomfortable because of a dream that's all about being out of control. And the reason that would trigger King Nebuchadnezzar is because he's used to being in total control. At this point in history, Babylon is the ruling kingdom of the world. And so he's king of the ruling kingdom, so he is in charge. But this dream is troubling him, and he's anxious, he's worried, he's sleepless. And he calls out to his wise men for help. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 2 in Daniel, in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. So these guys, at this point, everything's going pretty normal. The Chaldeans actually were a set-apart class of Babylonians who were especially wise and well-trained, and they actually had dream books they would turn to. They found remnants of them in archaeological digs where they would say, if you dream this, it means this. And so they thought, they could just use their little methods to tell the king what his dream meant. The problem is, obviously, there's no way to be sure that that book is correct. There's no way to be sure that your dream really means this or that. And Nebuchadnezzar wanted the right answer to what his dream meant, not just what some book says or what his wise men conjured up. So he made things a little bit more interesting for them. Verse 5, the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word for me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. So when you try to control what is already out of control, things have a way of going from bad to worse. Nebuchadnezzar had trouble. Now his wise men and their families have trouble. Wasn't just old Nebi couldn't sleep. Now his wise men probably can't sleep. Their families can't sleep because they're worried about their family and their homes. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, tell me the dream. Tell me the dream. You need to not only tell me what it means, you need to tell me what the dream is in the first place. There have been many mornings when I've said to Laura, I had such a weird dream last night. And she never says, I know, right? She always expects me to tell her what the dream was first. She never knows the dream until I tell her. Nebuchadnezzar is either so distraught by the dream that he's not thinking straight, or he's testing them because he knows this dream must be particularly significant. And so not only is the situation bad for sleepless Nebuchadnezzar, it's bad for the wise men. And that brings in our friends Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into this too. Brings them into this too. We ended last week with the four of them being granted prominence in the kingdom. In verse 19 of chapter 1 it said, and the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. They had a prominent post as these wise men. And they're lumped in with this too. So they hear about this when there's a knock on their door and somebody says, hey guys, king wants to gather us all together so he can kill us. Not exactly a real comforting greeting. We read that in chapter 6 and going on. King Nebuchadnezzar said, but if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation. They answered a second time and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. So the wise men said, look, we really need you to tell us what happened, then we'll tell you what it means. But the king answered and said, I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You've agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Not a great scene setting up here. Suddenly your four friends are facing execution instead of the exaltation they got in chapter 1. And it's all because of what the king's doing. He's trying to control what he can't control. He's trying to control a situation that's out of control, and things are going from bad to worse. That reminds me of the I Love Lucy episode in the chocolate factory, where they're starting out and they're trying to do their thing, and then the belt just starts speeding up and speeding up and speeding up. Everything's getting out of control, and so they're stuffing chocolate in their mouths and their clothes everywhere they can to try to keep up with things. But things are just getting bad to worse. They're going bad to worse. And it's funny in a TV show, but man, in real life, that's terrible. That's terrible. That's scary. When things are going from bad to worse, when you're trying to control things and it's just not getting any better, it's scary. And you've been with loved ones who've been in that situation, or maybe your own situations. It's a feeling we never really want to talk about, but we've all experienced. We've all been through. And Daniel, there he is. He's in it. He's being asked to come up with the dream and its interpretation, or he'll die. Or he'll die. And it doesn't say this in there, but I'm willing to bet if he made something up, the king would not have responded well. He doesn't seem like he's a real agreeable guy. And if Daniel would have just come up with something to do this, it wouldn't have worked out, because he would have found out that trying to control an out-of-control situation makes things worse. So Daniel doesn't do that. Doesn't make up something he doesn't know. He instead goes with what he does know. And remember last week, chapter 1, he knows God is sovereign. He knows God is sovereign. And he knows a great truth about a God who is sovereign. A God who is sovereign. And that's that what's out of control for us is never out of control for God. What's out of control for us is never out of control for God. Out of control, if I could be a bit obvious, means literally without control. There's nothing to control the situation, nothing to control the scenario. Well, God has never been in that kind of situation. He's never been in that kind of situation. Just because you can't control something doesn't mean it can't be controlled, because God is in control. Even Job, the classic example of a life falling apart. His built home and houses and barns were destroyed, and then his family was afflicted, and his livestock and everything else. He was being tormented and tested by Satan. But if you remember in Job, before he could do any of that, Satan had to go to God for permission, because God was in control. John Piper says Satan is a lackey with a leash. God holds the leash. He doesn't go any further than God will allow him to go. God is in control. As soon as you bring God into an out-of-control situation, you stabilized the unstable. You stabilized the unstable, and you can start to get your bearings. Continuing in verse 14. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men at Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Went from this initial alarm of being called to die to being able to breathe, knowing that nothing happens outside of God's control. Nothing happens outside of God's control. And once you breathe, you start to think about, what could I actually do? What can we actually do here? And so Daniel reached out to the other believers around him, his friends. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. One of the coolest things I think I get to do as a pastor, and it doesn't happen all that often, but when I've had opportunities to pray with scared and anxious people, seeing the change that occurs just from sharing a prayer together, it's really powerful. A few specific memories stick out in my mind where there was genuine uncertainty about life, especially one, I remember sitting in the ICU with somebody, and things felt out of control, but then you pray with people, you have that chance to take a breath. Remember, God's in control. You don't hold back. You lean into who God is. You mentioned Bible verses about him being in control. And there may not be healing, but there's hope. There may not be healing, but there's hope. And hope is calming. Hope forces you to look to a positive when all you see around you is negative. You don't know how the situation will end, but take that time, reminded that God is in control. And another benefit of doing that, taking that breath, remembering he's in control, it positions you to hear from God. It positions you to hear from God. When all you're doing is running off of panic, you're not really stopping to talk to anybody. You're not really stopping to listen and really have that clarity of thought. But when you take that breath and you remember he's in control, it positions you to hear from God, to learn from God. And in doing so, you're encouraged to trust God, even in the midst of an out-of-control situation. Because a God who is in control is a God who can teach. A God who is in control is a God who can teach. Teachability, it always comes from humility. Teachability always comes from humility. A teacher who's in control of their classroom, who has students who are able to learn. They will learn because the teacher is in control. But if one of those students tries to be in control of the classroom, there's chaos, not coursework. Control allows for teachability. That's why classroom management is so important. A God who is in control is a God who can teach. And God has always taught his people from a place of control. From the garden to Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joshua, even in the New Testament, Jesus said, I am the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He established that he is in control. He established that. He's in charge, and therefore he can teach. And then, of course, there's Israel here in the Old Testament. Israel, when they decided to be in control themselves, things fell apart. When they decided they didn't want God to be in control anymore, things fell apart. They stopped learning. They got themselves exiled. Divided the kingdom, exiled both. You see, you can't take God's control away and expect life to go well. You can't take God's control away and expect life to go well. And when you take God's control away, you'll quickly stop learning God's ways. You'll stop learning God's ways. Hashtag Note Well America, right? Note Well America. But here, because of one man standing up, look how God's control overtakes the entire situation. Beginning in verse 24. Actually, verse 19 says, the mystery was revealed to Daniel. And then in verse 24, Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. The king declared to Daniel, his name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? And Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be made known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. So here he is, an out-of-control situation, an impossible situation. Tell the king his dream. And because Daniel turned to the God who is in control, he was able to do that. So when life is out of control and the solution is a mystery to you, when a dream keeps you up at night and you want to know what it means, it's a mystery to you. When a king is having a dream he can't figure out and expects somebody to tell him the dream and what it means, that's a really big mystery. But look at verse 28. There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Revealing mysteries is what God does. And so that invites us to learn from him. To learn from him. Let him teach us. God knows the unknowns of life. Daniel went to the one who knows the unknowns. And so Daniel goes on and tells the king about this dream. You saw, O king, and behold, a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that had struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he has given, wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all, you are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes and the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, a great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation sure. Today we're just dealing with the theology of this. That's quite the dream. We're just dealing with the theology of that. When we get to chapter 7, we'll actually talk about the specifics and the details and more of what this actually looks like, because chapter 7 and chapter 2 parallel one another in the book of Daniel. But the basics are the world kingdoms. That's what Nebuchadnezzar was dreaming about, these world kingdoms. And if you're the king and you're Babylon, there's all these kingdoms that are going to come after you. I can understand why he'd be sleepless, wondering what it means when this statue is destroyed in his dream. So we have Babylon, and then we have Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, then 10 kingdoms following Rome, and then the rock is Jesus. Jesus comes to rule and reign forever when there will never be another kingdom again. We'll get much more specific as we go on in Daniel about that. But the theology is this: God is in control. He's sovereign over a man's sleeplessness, over revealing mysteries, and over who is the dominant power in the world at any given time. Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel accurately called him the King of Kings in verse 37. He said, "You, O king, are the King of Kings." But he said it's because God allowed him to be the strongest king on the earth at that time. Don't get impressed with Nebuchadnezzar being the King of Kings, though. Be impressed with the fact that God allowed him to have that position. Be impressed with the fact that God, in his control, allowed that to be the case. That God would allow each successive kingdom to rule and reign for a specific amount of time before the stone, the rock, would come, would crush them, and a mountain would fill the earth. And we would see God's rule and the reign of Jesus forever. So because of the king's dream and a man who knew God was in control, we have a foretelling of world history. We have a foretelling of world history. And we can't miss the fact that as amazing as that is, the reason it's there is because God is in control. Period. Not just with the big stuff, the kings and the countries and the story. He's in control with the little stuff too, like dreams, or like a king's threats against his wise men and their families, or against individuals, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. God is in control of the big stuff and the small stuff, and what that teaches us is you're not too significant for him to overrule you, and you're not too insignificant for him to overlook you. You're not too significant for him to overrule you. You're not too insignificant for him to overlook you. When you're in a situation that's out of control, make sure that you put him in control so that he can teach you what he wants to teach you. The only reason we have chapter 2 like this, the only reason it works out, is because of chapter 1, where Daniel got into this place of prominence within the kingdom. And chapter 1 only worked out because Judah was captured by Babylon. And Judah was only captured by Babylon because they acted like God wasn't in control, even though he was in control. So the people were acting like he wasn't in control, but God still knew exactly what he was doing to orchestrate what he needed to happen, because God was in control. And while Judah was acting like God wasn't in control, there were parents of 4 boys who said, "I don't care what my country is doing, God is in control in this house." And so they gave their boys a heritage of faithfulness to God, which would then get them through chapter 1 when the king wanted to change their diet. And they said, "No, we can't do that. I will not defile myself." It doesn't matter what part of the story we look at or what part of the story we study. The fact is that God is in control and made everything else possible. And so the issue for us then becomes, will you turn to him as the one who is in control of your life too? Will you trust him to be the one who's in control? Will you trust him and let him teach you, even through the circumstances that feel out of control? Will you trust him enough to take that breath and be teachable because God is in control? What do you do when you realize that you're not too significant for God to overrule you? And what do you do when you realize you're not too insignificant for him to overlook you? What do you do when you come to those terms? Well, both the king and Daniel show us this. They show us what they did. And the great thing about a God who's in control is you respond to God's control with worship and rest. You respond to God's control with worship and rest. First, Daniel. Before he even approached the king, after the dream had been revealed to him in a vision, he worshiped. He acknowledged God's control and he worshiped God. Beginning in verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the Lord, the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. Dwight Pentecost was a longtime professor at Dallas Seminary, and he said Daniel responded appropriately by offering praise to God, and he acknowledged that God is a God of wisdom, knowing the end from the beginning, and a God of power, for whatever he determines, he can do. What a relief God's control of the situation had to be for Daniel and his friends and for the wise men and their families. Then there's the other relief for Daniel of a job of even greater significance in the land of exile, which we'll read here in a moment. But then King Nebuchadnezzar, he responded to God's control with worship and rest as well. Because remember, he couldn't sleep before. Now his dream's been identified, his dream's been interpreted. The man can finally take a nap. But this is how he reacted. Beginning in verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. Now that's not Daniel taking all the glory, that's just the king acknowledging Daniel's God. The king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Notice what the king did. He said, number one, God is in control of him. God is in control of me. Nebuchadnezzar said that because he called him the Lord of kings, the one over the kings. That is your God, Daniel. And he said God is above all the other gods. And so worship and rest defined the moment when God got to be in control for King Nebuchadnezzar. Worship and rest. You're freed to rest. You're freed to worship. Worship and rest. As people who trust in a God who's in control, they should define our moments when life feels out of control. They should define our moments when life feels out of control. Worship and rest. How often do we stop to think, well, I need to worship in the midst of this? I need to rest and trust that God is in control in the midst of this. But when God is in control, worship and rest can be our reality. I think a boating accident would certainly qualify as an out-of-control moment. There's an organization called the Navigators, which is all about spreading the gospel and equipping disciples. They have campus groups all across the country, I think around the world actually, reaching college-age kids, but they do far more than just that. Dawson Trotman founded the Navigators, and one day while he was leading a ministry, they, I guess, had some rec time, and they got on a boat. And a girl got on the boat with him, and he asked if she could swim, and she said no. And so he made sure they switched seats so that she'd be in a safer spot if something happened on the boat. Well, a big wave sent them both into the water, and he held her up the entire time until she was rescued. After they'd rescued her, they never saw him again. He went under, and he never came back up. They called his wife, who was there, and so she came down to the dock. And now listen, as this is what Chuck Swindoll says of the rest of the story. The bitter news of Dawson Trotman's drowning swept like cold wind across Shroon Lake to the shoreline. Eyewitnesses tell of the profound anxiety, the tears, the helpless disbelief in the faces of those who now looked out across the deep blue water. Everyone's face except one, Lila Trotman, Dawson's widow. As she suddenly walked upon the scene, a close friend shouted, "Oh, Lila, he's gone. Dawson's gone." And to that she replied in calm assurance the words of Psalm 115:3. "But our God is in the heavens, and he does whatever he pleases." All of the anguish, the sudden loneliness that normally consumes and cripples those who survive did not invade the woman's heart. Instead, she leaned hard upon her sovereign Lord. When life feels out of control, if you've got a God who's in control, you can rest and you can worship. You can rest and you can worship. So from Daniel chapter 2, we're taught to intentionally turn your out-of-control situations over to a God who's never been out of control. He's always in control. Learn from him. Worship and rest. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, hearing about what you did with Daniel and the king and the wise men, it's incredible. And yet we can think of the times when life has felt out of control for us and start to think that maybe our situation is different. Maybe you did it then, but can you really do it now? This morning we say, yes, you can. Yes, you can. The situations that we wish were different, the situations that are out of our control, help us to trust you with them. Help us to remember you're in control, to take that moment to just refocus that you're in charge. And then teach us through those moments. Show us what you want to show us. Enlighten us. Correct us. And then as we lean into your control, may we worship and rest before you. Because you are in control. God, we thank you for that. We thank you that even with the people who are in the midst of punishment in Babylon, you're still in control. You haven't let go of the strings. You haven't stopped looking out for them, and you'll never stop looking out for us. It's because you care for us. It's because you love us. Because you're purposeful, and you didn't create us to just be haphazard in life, but to experience the control of your goodness, your grace, your chastening, even your correction when we need it. Thank you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray.